All right, well, let's jump into digital compositing, which plays a huge role in matte paintings. And the reason why I like showing that old clip of Walt Disney explaining the multi-plane camera to his audiences back in the 60s is because that exact process is widely used in digital compositing today. But of course, instead of a huge contraption made of metal with planes of glass separating the artwork and a big camera on top, just turning it sideways and putting it into the computer, and you basically have 2.5D compositing or camera projections and all kinds of good stuff, which, taking a look at our slide right here, is a good example of that. This is a shot from within the Nuke compositing package, and it's basically the multiplane camera just turned on its side, of course, in a digital form. So it's not, the multiplane camera concept is not lost to time. It just moved over to digital compositing. Here's another shot of a 3D scene in Nuke. And as you can see, you're putting your backgrounds, your clouds, and everything is basically separated out instead of planes of glass. It's cards with alpha channels. And as you can see, though, you have more creativity and more ability to enhance your shots with this system naturally because, one, you can move the camera. Two, you can actually tilt the quote-unquote glass planes towards the camera or in any direction. Not just tilting them, but you can deform them. You could bring in 3D geometry. You could introduce atmosphere in between all the slots of artwork. So it's basically like the multiplane camera on steroids. So today's multiplane camera is most commonly found in some of the most widely used compositing package in visual effects, and that is called Nuke. Nuke is pretty much the gold standard for a professional digital compositing program. It's invented by joint effort of, I believe, Digital Domain, and it's used at pretty much every major animation and visual effects house out there. Now, some people may be wondering, wait a minute, what about After Effects? After Effects has its place. It's very good at what it does, but for working on film with serious camera projections and big resolution, Nuke is pretty much the program to go with for professional visual effects in cinematic and episodic television. But we're going to talk about both. And I say that with reservation because I don't want anybody to think, if I know this tool, I could do this job. Not the case. The case is actually, if you're a talented artist, you can do the job regardless of the tool. So don't get hung up on whatever tools you have. You can make something incredible with After Effects. In fact, you can make an entire movie in After Effects, and they did. It's called Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow, which I think is a great film. Commonly called 2.5D shots. These types of shots are used heavily in shots that require new environments with speed and cost at a minimum, while control and iteration are at a maximum. Basically, every matte painting today is done with 2.5D camera projections, so the parallax is basically perfect. This is an example of the 3D view with the art in the viewport. This, an example of what you're looking at, I probably should have mentioned this earlier, are the nodes that you would put together that define what the final output is going to be. If you're wondering what a node is simply just a series of instructions encapsulated in a little visual, could be anything, a circle or a box or whatever. And as data is coming through, it just is interpreted by whatever the node instruction is doing, whether it's a color correction or a camera or whatever. And that's all it is. It's actually just a simple, simplified visual way to conduct complicated chain of effects. What's the advantage of this 2.5D workflow? Well, 2.5 dimension is actually what it's talking about, 2.5D. It's not 2D, and it's not 100% 3D, 2.5D. And I'll tell you what the difference is here. It's a term used to describe either 2D graphical projections and similar techniques used to cause images or scenes to simulate the appearance of being in a three-dimensional world, when in fact they're basically flat cutouts in 3D space. If you remember at the beginning of this talk, we looked at theaters and how theaters kind of fake an environment by putting scenery up on flat pieces of wood, but in 3D space. It's the same exact process. So that's why I love talking a little bit about the history of this stuff, is because looking back at what they did before determines how we do it today and why we do it today. So let's talk about some of the advantages of doing it this way. Number one, it's fast. Speed in construction. A matte painting painted with oil, or many matte paintings painted in oil and placed on a multi-plane camera, is slow. It's a lot of work. It could take weeks or months to complete all of that. But with this 2.5D digital workflow, it's very, very fast to actually do. And one of my golden rules in visual effects is never go 3D until you have to. Well, what does that mean, never go 3D until you have to? Well, here's a typical shot, perhaps, of A Christmas Carol. And maybe this is a painting, and we're pretending this is our matte painting, okay? And I just chose this. It's just a fun illustration, and it's probably not a visual effects matte painting per se, but we can use it on any form of art. And what we're seeing here is, if this is a matte painting for the intro of perhaps a new movie, The Christmas Carol, and the camera is pulling in on the scene, the camera is going what we call into the Z and going towards the large cathedral up here. Well, if the objects in the background and midground are flat, on flat cards or with an alpha channel, you're not going to see much difference as you pull in closer to them, because they're only showing you what's called parallax distortion or parallax effect. But the foreground objects, the objects that are very, very close to the camera, they are going to look more fake, because as you go past them, the illusion is going to break down, because it's going to look like it's simply on a card, and you're not getting any perspective distortion. So there's two types of distortion when you're talking about animation in a matte painting. There's parallax distortion and there's perspective distortion. And what you would see, like for example, on this chimney or this roof, is you're going to start to see some of the back pixels, the back sides of things, and you're also going to see that the front of objects should move at a faster rate than the back of objects. You don't notice that discrepancy when things are far away, but for an object that's very close to you, moving towards the camera, this corner should imperceptibly be moving a little bit faster than this corner, and you will notice that if it's too close to the camera. It may not be apparently obvious at first, but your eye will say, something's wrong here. So that's why I say, never go 3D until you have to. And you'll know when you have to, because it's just not working. The shot looks fake. So these 2.5D flat images, you can keep them as 2D. But these assets up here, if it's not looking correct because they're too close to camera, then you have to go 3D, put these in 3D. Perhaps they're modeled, textured, and lit. And now you've created a mixture of 3D and 2D. So what this means is constructing a flat drawing of a background and constructing that. If you had to construct all of this, by the way, in 3D and not just the objects here, this would take a very, very long time. And even if you had these assets in 3D, you're still going to want to render them with one shot, one render, and then project them in a 2.5D space, so you can iterate on the scene so much faster than if this was one big scene in Maya and it's taking you forever to test your camera moves. So what this means is constructing a flat drawing of a background object a lot faster than modeling, UVing, texturing, lighting, rendering, etc., etc. If the missing parallax is not noticeable, it also massively speeds up rendering, of course. Now, Pixar has been progressing past the typical matte shots on their last couple of films here. And they've invested heavily in tools and programmers that create programs that procedurally create real 3D environments based off of satellite and topographic data maps. And using USGS data for terrain and satellite information for clouds, these animators, especially on this movie here, The Good Dinosaur, created a 108 square foot area where the film takes place. And everything on the screen is actual 3D geometry that is rendered. There's no matte paintings, there's no set extensions, there's no touching up, because it's all actually in 3D. And Pixar uses this for natural worlds now. The Good Dinosaur gives us perfect distant parallax, albeit with a very high initial investment overhead because they had to code up all these tools to do it. But the key to this is, you're probably thinking, why would you do all that? Matte paintings look just as good. Well, here's the key. Here's some advantages to this. Number one, I said it's procedural. And what procedural means is that you're making the computer do a lot of the work for you in terms of randomization. If you had to go and populate this scene here with all these bits of grass and trees and different foliage, and you do all that by hand, it's going to take forever. Why not give the computer a library of assets to choose from and have the computer, with some rules applied to it, lay out the lay of the land, so to speak, so you're not hand planting every single flower and bush and tree. Let the computer do that procedurally for you with randomized scale and rotation and things of that nature. That's the advantage of that. That's not to say that there are disadvantages to this. Obviously, every scene is going to take longer to render. But if you're Pixar and Disney, you have a pretty big render farm. If you're wondering what a render farm is, it's basically just a set of dedicated computers off to the side somewhere, or perhaps on the cloud, that just handles all the rendering for you. Those aren't the computers used for actually creating the content. It's just for rendering the content. The average render times on this film, by the way, was 48 hours a frame. But that's okay because the Disney Pixar render farm has 30,000 computer cores of rendering power. So they have power to spare. So speed in construction, never go 3D until you have to. Another huge advantage to this is it's easily editable for iterations. Fast camera testing, tweaking of placement, little to no extensive rendering when you're doing this. Somebody may come over your shoulder and say, shot looks great, but the tree's out of place. Can you just move that tree or get rid of the tree or put that building further back there or give me a different sky? Well, if you did all that in 3D, you would say, okay, yeah, I could do that, but come back tomorrow when I have the new renders. If you're doing a 2.5D digital composite, you can swap out the images very quickly and you get almost instantaneous results, instantaneous feedback. So it's very fast to edit these things. Separation of depth, color corrections, camera effects. There's no baked-in DOF. Depth of field is what I'm talking about. And baked in is what happens when you render something and you can't take it back out of a render. For example, if you render depth of field into a render of our sky back there, or if you recall the image of London in winter, if you baked in or if you basically flattened in the weather, and then somebody said, it's a little too foggy, can you take out some of that fog? Well, without working smartly, you really can't if it's just one render. Now, normally when you render, and we'll talk maybe a bit about that later, you're going to render in separate passes called AOVs, arbitrary output variables. And of course, that gives you a lot more creative freedom to see how the final render looks in post-production in compositing. But that's outside the scope of our discussion at the moment. But separations of depth and color corrections and camera effects, it's all right there for you to play around with depth of field or rack focus or atmospheric perspective or all kinds of good stuff like that. And then you're going to get a larger group of experts to do this for you. Traditional matte painters, since the job has gone away, the artists have gone away. But you're going to find a lot of digital compositors. So that makes production a lot easier compared to, and I'm also saying compared to studio proprietary tools, like Disney's tools and Pixar's tools and DreamWorks tools, they have their own proprietary tools, which means they've coded it up in-house and, it's a trade secret and they have to train their people on how to work with them. New hires don't know how to work with their tools, so they have to learn that. If you're using off-the-shelf software as a basis for your VFX pipeline, then everybody's kind of on the same playing field. And you could say, I need more compositors. A lot of people know Nuke. You come on in and your ramp-up time isn't quite as long because you already know the software as opposed to custom software that's already in the studio. And like I said, so that goes hand in hand with cheaper cost. Nuke Photoshop licenses are relatively cheap compared to creating your own custom tool sets and then training everybody on them. And then if something breaks, you got to have the programmers to fix it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.